Hey, welcome back to The Dive. Today on the show, we have the founder and managing director of Radiant Energy Group, Mark Nelson. Mark is an outspoken nuclear advocate who is joining us today to talk about the current state of nuclear energy globally. He will also address some of the myths that we hear about nuclear, as well as how he sees the regulatory environment changing and so much more. And make sure to stick around to the end to hear all about the work in the clean energy industry that Radiant Energy Group has been up to. Hey, Mark, welcome to The Dive. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here, Cassandra.
Okay, so let's start off with your view of the current state of nuclear energy globally.
So nuclear energy is really having a cultural moment, but that wouldn't mean much if it weren't backed up by having an industrial moment. In the developing world, in the industrializing world, so we're talking China, India, and a few other of their neighboring countries that are attempting to get rich, they are building national policy around growing nuclear. They're going to grow nuclear no matter what Western Europe and North America do. They are going to build nuclear plants as they're doing now. They're going to get good at building nuclear plants, and they're going to export nuclear plants. So the question is what the West and the Western aligned Pacific nations are going to do. What we're seeing is that countries that were anti-nuclear for the past decade are swinging around and becoming pro-nuclear. It doesn't mean they're immediately going to be able to build reactors. Doesn't mean they're immediately going to be able to turn on reactors, but it means they're putting policies in place to return nuclear to the center of energy policy. What we're also seeing, though, is something I would argue is completely new. That is some of those most powerful and rich oil and gas countries are exploring or expanding nuclear programs as we speak. And I'm not just talking about the Gulf states. Also, countries like Norway are rapidly becoming convinced that nuclear energy is what they should spend their oil and gas wealth building. So I would argue that although nuclear is not and will not be growing as fast as wind or solar have been and are right now, that there is wind in the sails of nuclear, and it is going to be growing across both areas where it's never existed and areas where it was once popular and fell out of style in the last decade.
Compared to what we've had the past few decades, how has nuclear energy evolved over time?
Well, one of the interesting things we're seeing is that technology that was more or less invented in the 60s and 70s is still the technology of choice, is still being built well across the world, and is still operating well, both the new and the old versions of those reactors. So in some cases, in some fields, technology has utterly transformed that field. That's not the case in nuclear. Reactor designs that are proven to work are still the designs of choice for countries that are building their economy off of nuclear. However, what we're also seeing is inventors and entrepreneurs from all over other technology and finance areas are becoming interested in nuclear, and many of them are becoming interested through starting nuclear companies. It's not clear which of these are going to be successful. It's not clear if we're going to see a transformation from disruptive technology, from new types of reactors. What is clear, however, is that the interest level is extremely high, and people are going to continue trying to take shots on goal, whether that means joining existing companies, investing in existing technologies, starting new companies, or pushing ahead with new technologies. We're going to see people try everything, and there may be new directions that come from there. My bet at the moment is that what already has proven to work extremely well in countries that are good at construction will probably keep going. So that's how I'd say the technology and the business side has evolved. What's new is that finance community is accepting nuclear as clean, much more behind the scenes than in public, I have to admit at the moment. But almost anyone you talk to in finance is saying we're not really sure why it's not counted as clean. And if our clients were just asking for it now, we'd probably count it as clean. But we really think that nuclear is going to come in the future as a clean energy investment. We're seeing governments and trading blocs start to make legislation that cautiously counts nuclear as clean, This is a radical change over 20 years ago. Even though the technology that will be implemented, that will be invested in, is largely going to be the same, finance attitudes are changing. That brings us to culture. There has been an absolute cultural transformation of nuclear, where leading countries across the world have embraced nuclear across the political spectrum. This is big. Nuclear has basically never had cross-spectrum political support in democracies. This is a fundamentally new thing. Hollywood stars, even some that were traditionally against nuclear, are coming out and making cautious statements about how they've changed their mind or how they want to keep nuclear that we already have. I see nothing that would stop this transformation in culture from happening. 10 years ago, we had Fukushima Daiichi, approximately 10 years ago. 20 years ago, nuclear was right-wing coded, and mainstream center and center-left politicians across democracies and rich countries were against nuclear. That is changing. I don't see anything that would stop it, and I want to explain that one point. Fukushima Daiichi was a triple meltdown. If only 10 years after, the sentiment is improving for nuclear, it suggests that even new, scary nuclear moments are not likely to impact this cultural transformation that is leading to positive sentiment in nuclear in Hollywood and in NGOs, nonprofit sectors, and young wings of political parties across the world.
So speaking of Fukushima, do you have any sense of if we might see reactors in the countries that were turned off after Fukushima get turned back on?
Yes, there is a limit, and it depends on how the reactors were turned off. If the reactors were turned off, washed with acid to clean out the internals, and then starting to be cut apart, that's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to start up those reactors again. Some countries do it kind of halfway. For example, Germany rushed to phase out nuclear after Fukushima Daiichi, and they've turned off most of their reactors except their largest, newest, biggest, best performing ones. There's 3 still on, and they're due to shut off in April. But of some of those large, good performing reactors that have been shut off recently, permission to deconstruct a reactor has not been granted by the central government. That means is somebody somehow, maybe a German deep state, there's hedging going on, at least at the moment, that if needed, Germany could turn around and reinstitute nuclear energy. And for the 3 reactors still on, of course, it will be up to a year or longer before they'll even be in a position to apply and receive that decommissioning license, in which case they could return. Japan is the country that turned off its entire nuclear fleet, mostly just waiting. So in some of their nuclear plants, they tore them apart, dismantled it. Most of the nuclear capacity in Japan was turned off in a reversible way, just waiting. And they've been upgraded, and they've been applying for permission with a newly strengthened and independent nuclear safety regulator in that country to keep operating. But we're waiting to see them come on. The wait is mostly about local authorities, local courts that have blocked the restarting. But Japanese people have finally polled that they've, in a recent poll released, that more than half want to see nuclear plants come back on. And then in the political class and the industrial sector, there's overwhelming understanding that the nuclear plant should return on. In Sweden, there's a country that had some of the best nuclear plants in the world. They were turning off because of anti-nuclear policies. It's that government with those policies has been kicked out of office. A strongly pro-nuclear government has been returned. They want to stop shutdown. They've been exploring whether restarts are possible. It's a little grim. It's not clear whether it's going to be politically possible. Physically possible, it's on the edge. I hear different things from sources close to the plants. Korea is an example of a country that went anti-nuclear, strongly against its security and economic interests because of an ideologically anti-nuclear president. That president's gone. New president's back. I don't know if they're going to restore the closed reactors to operation, but they're definitely restoring nuclear to the center of national policy. They're continuing to construct faster than they were under the last anti-nuclear president. So these are just a few of the examples. In general, it's hard to restart nuclear, if ever. It has happened. It's not unprecedented, but it's usually happened when It's been known that the reactor would restart someday, and it was just kept in good condition waiting. It's very rare that nuclear plants have been shut down with the intent to keep them off and have been returned to service. This may be the first time in history we see a wave of plants returned to service, having been shut down thinking they would not return to service. We'll see.
Now, nuclear energy is a controversial topic, and there are several concerns associated with it. There's safety, waste management, proliferation risk, cost, and environmental impacts. Let's talk about the waste for a minute. When someone brings up nuclear waste, how do you typically respond?
It's so simple for me. I say, let's just go Dutch. Let's use the Dutch technique. And people typically ask, what do the Dutch do that's so special? And I say, well, I visited their facility. They have a facility for their nuclear waste across the street, basically, from their working nuclear plant. It's designed by excellent architects and designers. It's built thick, so it protects the waste against airplane crashes or any attempt to access the waste that's unauthorized would not be successful there. However, that's not the problem with nuclear waste. No one has ever been injured or killed from spent nuclear waste. It's just not a thing that occurs. The reason why is that it's so easy to shield the nuclear waste with heavy concrete and heavy steel. No moving parts. It's very easy. You just put concrete and steel around the nuclear waste and you're done. But that doesn't satisfy the public. You have to do what the Dutch did. They have a museum on site to explain the history of radiation in consumer products, history of nuclear materials, of the scientists who discovered them. And finally, they have a beautiful cloud chamber to show mostly kids from visiting schools what the universe looks like if you could visualize the radiation all around us, coming in from other parts of the cosmos, coming in from our own bodies. You can see that going into the cloud chamber and be visualized. The whole universe is radioactive, just a matter of selecting how much radiation you want coming out of a facility. So after they show people this museum of radiation, they show the long-term plan to talk to the public and decide when and where, if necessary, they would put the nuclear waste under the earth. I say it's not necessary. You just explain to the public, give them the option. And if they're comfortable with these museum tours and the tours of nuclear waste, no need. Finally, they tour people through the escalating levels of radioactivity from the lowest level waste, like the clothing used, the shipped clothing at the plants, which may have a little particles, but it's just not that important. But most countries have strict laws around any materials that were ever around nuclear operations. So that is one type of waste, and they put it in one type of building. Then the heaviest nuclear waste, the most serious nuclear waste, is the radioactive particles coming back from the recycling facilities in France. These are canisters of glass infused with highly radioactive particles. They put them in columns. They put the columns in a floor and ceiling kind of a brace, and then they allow you to walk across the structure, and you can feel the warmth of the radiation, feel the warmth coming in the floor. The floor is about 1 meter thick concrete, and they let kids go and see and learn about it as part of a science education field trip. That's the answer. Nuclear waste is already not hurting people. That's not the problem. The problem is that people don't realize it because they can't visit it. So once we set up good visiting access to nuclear waste, we've solved the nuclear waste issue.
So outside of nuclear waste, what are some of the other biggest myths about nuclear energy, and what needs to happen in order for the sentiment to change?
Here's one. There's a bunch of people worried about running out of minerals, running out of, say, lithium for batteries, running out of oil and gas. Peak oil is a long-running controversy about whether we are going to not be able to provide more oil to a growing world. In nuclear, there's a concern about uranium. We'll run out of uranium. To this, I say absolutely not. Nuclear is a little magical in that if you ran low on uranium for whatever reason, high prices or difficulty moving between different countries that were not friends anymore, you can simply use the uranium a different way and get vastly more energy out of it. You can use reactors that get energy out of even nuclear waste, for example. You could have the entire world living at the energy usage of Western Europe for millions of years before there's any real limitations on how you get energy from uranium, at which point you just, you have a number of methods to get that fuel and to keep the world going. So A million years, that's past us, right? People have done calculations to show, even billions of years will be okay, at which point the sun will expand and burn off the atmosphere. So it's you might say, as renewable as wind power at that point, if it lasts as long as our atmosphere does. That's one of the biggest myths I see cropping up that's not based on nuclear fear. We already answered the nuclear waste myth, but you might call it a fear-based myth where people are afraid of some aspect of nuclear and they attach that fear to something they don't know much about in the nuclear cycle. So the waste, we've answered that. Reactor safety, that appears to just be answered by people just not being as afraid of nuclear anymore. I think that Chernobyl TV show showed that you could have an extremely scary, intense depiction of a major nuclear accident. You could even make up myths and lie about how dangerous it was, which the show did, and it still leads to young people being interested in nuclear rather than scared of nuclear. So Chernobyl kept operating for 14 years after the blast. Those types of reactors are still in operation in continental Europe today. I almost never meet anybody who knows any of those. When people hear that, they seem to get a little bit more relaxed about nuclear. So the myth of nuclear danger being something that will stop us from doing nuclear, I think that's fading away day by day. And I don't think it's necessary to invent new reactors in order to meet that challenge, even if new reactors may offer a way to put nuclear closer to cities that are already in existence. That may be the breakthrough we get from increased nuclear safety rather than acceptance. So for me, those are two of the big ones.
Okay, so let's move on and talk about governance. How do you see the regulatory environment working out in the U.S. under Biden leadership?
Well, the first thing you have to know about nuclear energy in Washington, D.C. is that Republicans and Democrats love it. Everyone from AOC to the Trumpers and the never Trumpers, there's a consensus that nuclear energy is okay. And there's a growing chorus of voices saying nuclear energy is not just okay, it's the best. What this means is that when House flips from the U.S. Congress flips from Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican, the works of the committees and the committee staffers that are doing the writing of legislation, that are pushing through policy, is almost continuous. I've heard people describe cooperation and trust behind the scenes among the people who are actually doing the day-to-day work of advancing nuclear legislation. Meanwhile, both Republicans and Democrats are demanding a faster, more nimble nuclear regulatory commission, fairly or unfairly. In this moment, I'm not making a comment about the quality or the limitations of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, just that everyone is putting pressure on it to move faster and to build, to allow the industry to develop and to build further. So I could not be more optimistic. Now, maybe I would want the Biden administration to put forward a bold plan of action to build a bunch of nuclear reactors in America. It's a little difficult to see that going through. It's not even clear if it could happen in a way that Republicans who claim that they love nuclear would support. But it is also true that under the Inflation Reduction Act, whatever that has in it for other energy technologies, nuclear plants around the country are applying for and receiving permission to uprate their reactors. That means increase the capacity of already existing reactors, which it just beats out on cost any other type of making clean, reliable energy. If you can just up the power of the reactors that already operate 365, 24/7, then that is an incredible sign that nuclear is functioning well under Biden, regardless of how much better it possibly could do if Republicans were in charge.
So you touched on drafting new legislation earlier, but I want to come back to that for a minute. The Nuclear Regulation Authority recently approved contentious safety evaluation changes and draft legislation to allow Japan's aging reactors to operate longer with no maximum limit specified. What do you think has led Japan to make a U-turn in nuclear policy?
Well, Japan doesn't have fossil fuels, and they're surrounded by enemies or the ocean. They don't really have a lot of choices in energy. They don't have a lot of sun, and they don't really have wind, and they have a very mountainous terrain where the valleys are almost already filled with people anyway. So nuclear is perfect for Japan. They just need to manage it against disasters, but they've learned how to do that. They've learned their lesson in a fairly severe and dramatic fashion from Fukushima Daiichi. So that's why Japan is rapidly returning to nuclear energy, at least in policy. Now, about the phrase aging reactors, it's just not true. There are almost no reactors on planet Earth that are aging. Only British reactors age in the way that we mean aging, like you're getting old, you can't function as well, and you eventually need to be turned off. In the rest of the world outside of Great Britain, nuclear energy gets better as it gets older. The facilities get stronger, they get larger, they operate more reliably. They often operate with fewer people and at lower cost over time. So that's not aging. The only thing that you could maybe say is aging is the steel in the pressure vessel that surrounds the nuclear fuel itself. But what we're finding around the world is that steel was made very well and very thick, and it's doing a great job standing up over extremely long time periods. So it's not that they're aging, it's that we keep pushing back what an old reactor would mean. We keep allowing it to operate longer and longer. But Japan doesn't even have that issue because the reactors in Japan mostly have not been operating. So if they haven't operated for a decade, they haven't had that wear and tear on the steel on the inside of the reactor vessel, meaning it would be, you don't even have to make an argument about the steel to say that reactors that have not been in operation should be able to continue once you clean them up and upgrade all the parts and switches and anything that needs to be upgraded in the general course of operation. Sure, do that. But if they haven't been on, then the steel hasn't been bombarded with neutrons. It has not been wearing. But even in the reactors that have been wearing, they're doing an amazing job keeping that steel in great shape. And we're seeing longer and longer lifetimes. How long? It's an open question. We're getting licenses for 80 years of operation in the US. For the Japanese reactors that are quite young, 20, 30 years old, and then a 10-year break, it's a no-brainer to continue to follow in the footsteps of their very similar designs in operation in the United States.
Now, Vladimir Putin announced plans to deploy a Sarmat nuclear missile called Satan II and nuclear submarines after suspending an arms treaty with the U.S. Do you think that the potential use of nuclear weapons impacts the case for nuclear power?
What an interesting question, and a touchy one to be sure. Let me first say that this is one of those questions that's almost all the answers are going to be faith-based. The top experts in the world don't know. The man on the street might have just as correct an answer with almost no background in the subject. So there's my caution. But what I will tell you is my view. During the period, the height of the Cold War, during the scariest parts of the Cold War, when everyone acknowledged that nuclear war was a real fear that could actually happen, with nuclear bombs spewing out of factories in the major nuclear weapons powers, new countries getting nuclear weapons from time to time, testing of nuclear weapons around the world, a great deal of nuclear weapon fear, that was when nuclear energy expanded the most, right? So if nuclear energy has already had an historical period of expanding rapidly in a time of nuclear insecurity, of nuclear fear, of nuclear weapons growth, then I think it's foolish to say that more nuclear weapons growth would, or even testing, if that happened again, would stop us from using nuclear energy. Now, that's not the exact same as your question, which is whether nuclear weapons, maybe the usage, would that affect nuclear energy? Impossible to tell, as I said. I strongly suspect, though, that in an insecure world where countries do not know for certain they'll have access to fossil fuels, and they won't know for certain they'll have access to rare minerals and materials that they need to create a battery-powered renewable energy system, that's a world where countries are going to be more likely to flee to the security, reliability, and self-reliance of a nuclear power fleet. So in my opinion, there's not much that can happen on the nuclear weapons and on the war side that will reduce the desire for nuclear energy in countries that feel they don't have enough of it today. And that's a lot of countries.
Why do you think that Germany is against nuclear power?
Well, it's a little complicated, and I go a little deeper than other people. But to me, it's this: Germany was conquered in World War II, split in two, had nuclear weapons stationed near it, on it, pointed at it, but without being able to develop its own independent nuclear arsenal. In fact, even France claims to have nuclear weapons pointed at Germany still. So Germans felt completely powerless in a nuclear weapons world, but what they could do is protest and stop nuclear power plants. You combine in some Cold War skullduggery with Russia helping establish a strong anti-nuclear movement in Western Germany, not Eastern Germany, but Western Germany, and then the recombination of East and West Germany leading to a dominant success of West German culture and thinking on nuclear energy, while you might say that the East Germany got its little revenge by becoming a source of politicians and expertise to bring in natural gas cheap by pipeline from Russia and to strip out nuclear in favor of Russian natural gas. All of that came together, and it has traditionally been more important to Germans than climate change. Germans may talk about climate change, but they prioritize turning off nuclear. Now, the polling is shifting. In Germany, the majority of citizens want nuclear energy to stay, but they're not in charge of the politics. They voted in politicians who said, we'll make sure the nuclear plants get shut off. Germany is also rich in the dirtiest, filthiest type of coal, lignite coal, which they mine from giant mines in the earth, gives them some confidence that they can just ignore environmental issues and replace their nuclear plants with lignite coal, and they'll survive. So in a Germany like this, popular sentiment that is turned around and says save nuclear, it hasn't been enough to turn the politicians around, but we can only hope going in the next few years that this error, this nuclear phase out, will be reversed in line with popular sentiment.
Okay, now, Mark, we have one more question for you here. What can you tell us about Radiant Energy Group?
Radiant Energy Group is a small energy consultancy I founded to combine, you might say, expertise in understanding the public and public views on energy with technical expertise in energy systems. There's what's called an energy transition happening. I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I think that we're just combining many types of energy at the same time, but companies and nonprofits ask me to speak and write along with my staff on this issue of where is energy going? How can we survive in a changing world? And what's the role of nuclear energy in that energy mix?
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Mark, and sharing your expertise with us. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much for having me, Cassandra.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope you learned something new about nuclear energy. And if you could just let us know in the comments below what you learned that really surprised you, that would be great. Bye.